From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you, and here's what's coming up. K-State's Glynn Tonsor on the cattle markets. He'll share a new analysis of the economic damage to the cattle industry brought on by the coronavirus outbreak. Then we'll have excerpts from the latest Cattle Chat podcast from the Beef Cattle Institute at K-State. This time, Brad White, Bob Larson, and Dustin Pendell are joined by K-State's Mike Apley and Dan Moser to take up a couple of cattle health management topics. And on this week's 4-H segment, K-State's Wade Weber joins Jeff Wickman to talk about the steps 4-H is taking to stay connected with members and others in the midst of social distancing. All that and more here on Agriculture Today.
For information on threatening weather, you should depend on the National Weather Service and their broadcast on NOAA Weather Radio. NOAA Weather Radio is an all-hazards radio network that provides up-to-the-minute weather information, including life-saving warnings anytime, day or night. NOAA Weather Radio also broadcasts information on man-made disasters, such as chemical spills, amber alerts, or other national emergencies. For the National Weather Service, I'm Bill Curtis.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today. Thanks for listening in on this Monday, and we bring up the cattle markets first with Glynn Tonsor joining us now. Glynn, a livestock economist with K-State Research and Extension. Glynn said succinctly, it's been a rough ride for the markets broadly, for the cattle markets definitely as well, obviously all tied to the coronavirus. You've put together some information here that captures just how dramatic the impact economically on the cattle trade.
Yeah, these the damages to date are quite dramatic. Go to our Ag Manager website, and it just got posted here over the weekend. The title is COVID-19 Economic Damage Assessment. It'll be easy to find. And to paraphrase, I basically showed two different ways to document the damages to the cattle industry. One approach gets us to a total industry number of $8 billion, the damage that's occurred, and another is over $9 billion. Implicit in this is the notable decline in sale prices, whether we're talking about calves, this coming fall, feeders this summer, fed cattle, as we speak, all the above, all those cattle classes have been hammered notably as we continue to work through the COVID-19 crisis.
As you say, the breakout, the numbers just jump off the page. Over $3.5 billion for fed cattle, $2.75 billion for the feeder cattle sector, $1.5 billion for those selling calves. So the pain is being felt throughout the cattle sector.
Very much so. And, I try to keep this resource, it's a 3-pager, trying to give some big picture context because there's a lot of discussion, not just in the cattle industry, but throughout the entire U.S. economy about the damage that's been done, and I'm trying to provide the resource to help. I note that because basically what I've done is highlight the impact from lower sales prices. It's important to note that there's nothing in this resource that would capture the damage on, having to do something different, paying more for labor or paying different for shipping and those kind of things. I'm pretty confident that, in the future, and I'll just say a month from now to be safe, when we look back on today and last week, we're going to learn that, the cattle industry, like everybody else, has had to do some adaptation. And it's not just the damages from sale prices. It's also kind of the cost of doing business has went up. Yes, fuel prices are lower, but, getting labor and permission and, finding the trucks to do everything we need and so on and so forth, I sort of gloss over that in this resource. And yet I get to an $8 or $9 billion damage number. So there is some shock with that. Embedded in that is we have a very large industry, lots of people, lots of animals in this industry. And when you do the exercise that I try to walk us through, you come up with, as I said, $8 to $9 billion damage estimates.
And do those numbers, Glynn, ramp up the longer that this situation endures? One presumes so.
Well, and that one gets hard to speak to, Eric, because, I never have a crystal ball. Our listeners know that. I joke that it's broke, gray, and fragmented in normal times. It's even more so now. And I'm not trying to make light of it. I just think that's an honest assessment. There's massive uncertainty hitting all markets, equity markets and the like right now. So it's hard for me to tell you if this gets worse going forward. But I do think if we break down the market this past week, we will see some of the dynamics at play there. And I'm actually a little more concerned about the cattle markets toward the end of this year than I am the near term. And that's going to show up in our comments.
Well, too, this past week, actually, with all the gloom and doom, we did see cash and futures prices both head back to the upside.
That's correct. So, we'll break down the board first because it gives me the near-term versus long-term point I just kind of set the stage for. So let's look at live cattle first. The April contract closed $99.50, so just under $100. That's up $4 from the prior week. We're up from $92 on Wednesday. I made that note because the market, it was at its low on Wednesday this past week, and we had a nice rally on Thursday and Friday. But importantly, that contract was at $111 on March 4th. So the fed cattle price decline is still substantial. Look further out to the October live cattle contract, and we were just below $96, only up $1 for the week, and down from $109 from March. I'm going to pause right there and say the April, the near-term recovery, was pretty strong towards the end of this past week. The October, which is the deferred live cattle contract, did not improve nearly as much. And embedded in that, I think, is growing concern, quote-unquote, longer term, so think 6 months forward, that the macroeconomic effects might spill over into adverse beef demand and then therefore have less demand for cattle. So the rally we had this week was much more front-loaded to cattle today, and we're going to see that in the cash market more hopefully this coming week, I think, and the near-term contracts. The story from those deferred contracts was, have we pulled the trigger on, if not a recession, at least a decline in demand for beef? We'll walk through the cash trade for fed cattle while we're talking feds. The 5 area Friday price came in at about 110, right on par with the prior week, up about $1. There's actually some mixed reports. Some put out the 5 area price at 111, some 110. But regardless, we were flat or up $1 from the prior week. There is lots of discussion that in anticipation that those cash prices will be higher this coming week. That's going to reflect the cutout we're going to talk about in a moment. Let's round this out and talk about feeder cattle. The Wallomine cash feeder cattle, very, very low volumes. One of the AMS reports noted it's the lowest non-holiday feeder cattle volume we've had in a long time. That basically tells me buyers and sellers were pausing, all this uncertainty going on. The Kansas market was called steady. There's a mixed bag. Actually, when you look nationally, there were several cases of $10 to $15 lower. But I think it's important to note it was pretty low volume of feeder cattle that transacted last week. When we look back at the board, the April feeder cattle contract closed just below 120, $119.50, up a full $7 from the prior week. That was up $10 from where it closed on Wednesday. So just like the fed cattle, we hit a low this past Wednesday and then rallied on Thursday, Friday. But we're still down about $15 from where we were early March on that contract. Looking further out to the October feeder cattle contract, it closed at 126 and change, up about $3 from the prior week, and it's still down about $18 from where we were early March. And here's where I'll repeat what I said earlier. That deferred feeder cattle contract did not rally as much and has been depressed more at this point than the nearby. And I think that, again, reflects that concern about going forward. If we have a recession or a weaker beef demand that comes from that, how much is that going to depress cattle prices? That's embedded in this. Deferred contracts have been beaten up more than the nearbys.
Well, as if more consternation was needed here, we look at what's happened with boxed beef and vis-a-vis the cash-fed cattle trade. There's this disparity, as in the boxed beef market has done quite well, to put it mildly, and that has actually raised a few eyebrows, Glynn.
It has, and like any time that happens, there's lots of politics and questions around it, and we can't answer all those now. Let me first say exactly what has happened in the boxed beef trade, and then we can come back to that. So this past week, the choice cutout closed at 254, and I will repeat that, it's 254. That was up from 208 the prior Friday. That is a very large increase. On the 16th, which was this past Monday, a week ago today, we were actually up 7.8% compared to the prior Friday. That's the largest daily increase in the series that goes back to 2004. For the week, that choice cutout is up 22%, to give us some context. So large increase. The story sort of mirrors over on Select, which hit the week at 240, up from 202 before. But the real story of why that's happened, I think, is revealed when we look at the primals. So our listeners probably know this is the composite choice cutout, and then we have individual primals underneath that. The chuck and the round primal were each up more than 35% compared to the prior week. And I'll remind everybody that chuck and round is the source of most of our ground beef products. That makes perfect sense to me, given the general discussion and observation we've seen in the marketplace is food service traffic has declined. We've had a massive shift over towards retail traffic, and specifically in there, massive interest in ground beef purchasing by households, that are now going to be home for beyond me to say how long we're going to be doing this, social distancing, working from home. So people are encouraged to have the food for a couple weeks at home. That's led to a massive run on ground beef in the retail channel, and the market, quote-unquote, confirmed that this past week. So chuck and round primals are key to pulling up that choice cutout. For additional historical context on that, the weekly change that we had last August, our listeners probably remember the Holcomb Tyson plant fire near Garden City. That weekly change was 10.3%. That reflects to me the supply shock that Holcomb fire had. It was a supply chain shock in the sense we weren't sure how we're going to be able to handle live cattle coming at the packing industry at that point in time. So there was kind of a depression in live cattle demand that, showed up equally across the primals. That's very different than what's happened this past week, where we had a consumer demand-oriented shock and this massive improvement in ground beef demand pulling up the chuck and round primal in particular has led to a non-uniform change in those primals and actually more than twice the surge in the composite choice cutout than we had back at the Holcomb fire. It's going to be fascinating to watch how that plays out in the next, I'll say 2 weeks in particular, as the entire food chain is adjusting to push more product through retail and less through food service and kind of meet the demands of the consumer there. This is going to get watched closely, and I'm sure next week we will be talking about it.
Before we let you go today, we do want to mention that you and colleagues in the Agricultural Economics Department have been very active of late, cranking out useful information on the markets and the agricultural economy related to COVID-19 and its impact. And we would invite folks to get at some of those materials, including several videos, Glynn, that you've had a hand in.
Yeah, so a week ago I posted a 2-minute video kind of overviewing things. Some of my colleagues have done that as well. I encourage folks to go to agmanager.info for that. For those that also follow on Twitter and other places, I encourage them to do that. That's timely. There's going to be no shortage of things to talk about. We will continue to try to get information out to you in this new era.
Appreciate your efforts and the input today, and we'll talk again soon, Glynn. Thanks for the comments right here.
Thank you, Eric.
That's from livestock economist Glynn Tonsor, K-State Research and Extension, on the cattle markets on this opening segment of Agriculture Today.
Make hand washing a healthy habit everywhere you go. Wash your hands with soap and water for at least 20 seconds, especially after going to the bathroom, before, during, and after preparing food, and before eating. If soap and water aren't available, use a hand sanitizer that has at least 60% alcohol. Life is better with clean hands. A message from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
Agriculture Today continues now as we hear once more from the team at the K-State Beef Cattle Institute. They recently conducted another BCI Cattle Chat podcast, and they brought in 2 guest contributors to take up a couple of cattle health management topics, along with regulars K-State veterinarians Brad White and Bob Larson, and livestock economist Dustin Pendell, another K-State veterinarian, Mike Apley, and soon-to-be K-State Associate Dean of Agriculture, Dan Moser, who prior to that new appointment was the president of Angus Genetics Incorporated. Here's the conversation.
We were able to sit down with Dr. Dan Moser, talk some about genetics, and Dr. Mike Apley, and talk about when to use antibiotics, how you make those decisions about when to treat. So if I'm deciding to use a drug, whether it's an antimicrobial or something else, Mike, what are some of the things that you think about?
Well, the first thing that always pops in my mind is I'm going to pick a drug because I think I can have a positive effect on the group or an animal. So there has to be a way that I can benefit them, and I want to know I have some evidence that it'll benefit them. So that's the first thing, is I want to do some good.
So when you're selecting a drug, figuring out if it's going to make a difference in either treatment outcome or whether that animal's going to survive through the disease.
Right. Well, kind of just to look at the other side, though, is any drug that's actually probably doing some good has the potential to do some harm. And some of those harms might be things like a residue, if it's a food animal or food or meat or milk. Could I cause some actual harm to the animal because of the active ingredients in the drug that I'm choosing? Or maybe even something where I'm harming the environment or potential future consumers. And those. So
the carcass, yeah.
So not only do I have to ask, does it do some good, but what are the harms and how can I control the harms?
But when you think about those goods or benefits and those harms, what is the cost associated with that? Because that's going to be obviously a big, thinking about the economics of any treatment plan.
Yeah, and I think the cost there is not just drug costs, right?
Oh,
so we talk about
absolutely
drug
not.
costs and labor costs and facilities costs and can I get them up? Any other things?
Injury costs to human and or animals, that's a small probability. But thinking about the environment or any of those harms that Bob was talking about as well.
Yeah, because you've done some cool spreadsheets in the past where you've looked at different procedures and it starts to add up as you think about the labor part of it, but then also facilities maintenance, people, injuries to cattle, injuries to people, those costs over the long term. If I'm building a treatment plan where I'm going to be treating lots of cattle over the long term, those add up.
Yeah, no, you want to, as you're building your treatment plans and you're thinking about the benefits and the costs, you want to make sure you think through every single cost. And there's a lot of them that you probably don't think about that, what happens if I get injured. But I know that's a small probability, but it still is a cost at the end of the day.
Or how long it takes to treat them. So we talked about, and you and I have had the discussion on pasture scenario, how long does it take if I'm going to go pull a calf out of the pasture? So it's more than just this drug costs this much and this drug costs less. It is, I still have to get them out of the pasture in either scenario.
Right, and that comes back to that time, right? How much time is it going to take?
And that brings up another point of, can I get it in the animal practically? And sometimes we say, well, we can put it through the feed instead of injecting it, and then we don't have to handle them at all. But if you compare 5 days of chlorotetracycline in the feed with a lot more drug given to one shot of a 200 milligram per mil single injection oxytetracycline product, there's nowhere near the actual drug exposure in the animal from that in feed that there is from the injectable. So there's also trade-offs besides just cost and convenience. There can actually be trade-offs in how well the drug works when you go to a more convenient route than a less convenient route.
And if I went with a convenient route, like in the feed or in the water, I probably have a lot more variability between animals. So when I give an injection, I'm pretty sure that every animal got the dose that I injected. But when I give it in the feed or water, there's probably a lot more variability between animals.
In dose and how much they absorb, a lot more variability in how much they absorb from feed or water versus an injectable. So there's a whole list of trade-offs that you have to consider in those. It can be fairly complicated.
And I wanted to talk about genetics and health, because we've talked for a lot of years about how to better predict health events, and we've looked at it from the veterinary side. How do we prevent them? Where do vaccines play a role? And then genetics has been discussed several times as part of this process. Where does that fit into the role? And I want to get perspectives on both where we've been and where you think we're going. So Bob, start us with where we've been.
Well, in my career as a veterinarian, we've known things that nutrition impacts overall health, housing affects overall health, the things that we can kind of control as managers. What we've always known is there's probably a genetic component. But my whole career, that's always been over the horizon. It's really not been something that we could address. Like, we knew that probably some cattle were just innately more protected against disease than others, or some are more susceptible. And this is beyond just how they respond to the vaccines. This is just them. And we've kind of known that just from observation, but really couldn't turn that into anything that as a veterinarian I could use to help my clients. I think we're getting closer, and one of the great examples is, and Dan is more informed than I am on this, is on the dairy side. They've instituted some genetic tests for mastitis and some issues that I honestly thought wouldn't work, that the genetic component was too small, that most of it was going to be management and environment. And it actually turned out that that was a really good tool for the dairy industry. And so are we going to see some good tools like that in the beef industry?
Yeah, I think, Bob, that as time goes on, just looking historically, some of that data has been collected on health outcomes, the incidence of respiratory disease in feedlot cattle. But that's, first off, the incidence is generally pretty low. And so you don't have enough information there to really separate. It's not like weaning weight where you can measure every animal and rank them. They're either sick or they're not, and hopefully not. We do everything we can to keep them all healthy. So generally when you analyze that data, it's very low inheritability. It's more driven by environment, experience, exposure, all those things. And so to this point, it's not been very productive to go down that. But as genomics has advanced and as there's new approaches that are being undertaken, I think we are starting to see some results and with a lot, I think, of optimism in the future.
Will it be different, though, because we see genetics selecting, and you use the example of dairy, which there's a much more uniform genetic base in the national dairy herd than there is in the national beef herd. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I think there is a much narrower sort of genetic base, but in that way, because beef is more broad, there's probably more opportunity to make improvement than what you have with dairy. So I think we still can. There's probably breed differences. There's probably some benefit from heterosis for some of these things, but it's not well quantified yet, but it will be soon.
It's harder to sort. There may be more opportunity for improvement, but it's a little hard to sort out when you've got a lot of different breeds.
Yeah, it's not as obvious. And then in a more extensive management, there's just, again, generally biosecurity isn't the same in beef as it is in dairy, all those things that play into it too.
Yeah. So what kind of decisions do I make as an individual producer relative to this? Or is this just something I say, this might come and it'll help me in the future? Or are there decisions I make today that are going to impact that?
I don't see anything from a genetic selection standpoint for health and immunity that I would practice today if I were a commercial cow-calf producer. We are conducting some research studies measuring what we call sort of inherent immunity by challenging cattle with vaccines, measuring response, both sort of the cell-mediated kind of things that you'd see with the blood test, as well as some of the physical things like injection site swelling, which can be an indicator of response as well, and putting that all into an index. There are actually some real promising data out of Australia that shows when cattle are classified into high, medium, and low immunity ratings, they see significantly different death losses when those cattle are put in a commercial feed yard, particularly with the low immunity cattle. The high and medium in the particular project we're working on are pretty close together, but the really low ones, they have a significant higher mortality and morbidity.
See, now that one makes sense to me with the immune response, that there'd be a strong genetic component to that. Whereas if you look at when we first started this conversation, we talked about did they get sick or not, which is actually a pretty different question. So can you respond well to a vaccination versus did you get sick? Did you get sick also influenced by environment and exposure and all those things that you talked about, Bob?
Yeah, exactly. And I think this is a great area, and again, so I've got several hats that I wear, but one of them is as a researcher. And this is an area that I agree, we don't really have a tool today for commercial cattlemen to use. But this is a great opportunity for people in the land grant system, researchers, to be looking forward and trying to do the work now for something that we hope will be a very valuable tool in the future, even if it's not actually available today.
And with all the technology in terms of electronic monitoring, whether you can measure a lot of these things in real time that you couldn't do 5 years ago. Right. And so getting good data on temperature, movement and locomotion, tracking all that to get more precise definitions of which animals are in fact unhealthy and which ones are healthy, that kind of data is what we need to drive this forward.
Absolutely. And I think that's going to continue to improve and how well we can get that data. And one thing today, and you guys talked about there's nothing different to do today. However, even long term, it's not going to replace proper preparation, proper management, proper animal husbandry as you look forward. So anything we can do today to minimize disease is good. And then if these come in the future, still a bonus. So don't count on this as, well, I'm just going to select my way out of if I'm having a health problem. It's going to be all the other things.
Oh, I think that's right. But as we get more challenged in some of the antibiotics and some of those things that we use routinely more than we might be able to in the future, I think then genetic selection may be able to make up some of that.
K-State's Brad White, Bob Larson, Dustin Pendell, Mike Apley, and Dan Moser. The BCI Cattle Chat podcast in full can be found at beefcattleinstitute.org. We'll return with more on this Agriculture Today.
Kansas farmers and ranchers are helping feed your family in the world. The largest contributor to the Kansas economy is beef cattle. How do you get that juicy steak on your plate? In order for you to enjoy your tasty meal, it requires the hard work of the producers, marketers, advertisers, processors, inspectors, transporters, packers, and consumers. So thank all these people and sit back, relax, and enjoy your tasty meal.
Agriculture Today continues now here on the K-State Radio Network. Eric Atkinson with you, and now today's agricultural news headlines coming your way. These courtesy in part of DTN. Tyson Foods told cattle feeders on Friday that this week it will add $5 per hundredweight to live cattle and just shy of $8 per hundredweight to dressed and grid cattle. That increase will be added to the base cash price for the week. Tyson Foods Director of Media Relations Gary Mickelson told Drovers Magazine that the one-time premium is an effort to demonstrate the company's commitment to cattle suppliers. Tyson operates 6 beef packing facilities in the U.S., harvesting an average of 155,000 head of cattle each week. Grocery meat cases have been emptied over the past 2 weeks as consumers gather food items in preparation for home isolation. The resulting retail demand caused a rapid spike in beef cutout prices, with the choice boxed trade closing Friday at $253 plus. Cash fed cattle trading from $105 early last week to $113 at the end of the week, as Glynn Tonsor mentioned earlier. The spike in the beef cutout price meant that beef packer margins may have exceeded $400 per head for the week. No announcement of a similar assistance payment from other packers has been made. The Trump administration announced it would limit non-essential travel across the borders with both Canada and Mexico, but officials also ensured that guest workers would continue to be allowed into the country. During a briefing at the White House on Friday, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo pointed to the H-2A agricultural workers as one of the groups exempt from border closure with Mexico. Quoting Pompeo, "We're very concerned about H-2A visas and particularly agricultural workers who are going to need to get across." He went on to say, "We're going to make sure we do everything we can to keep that part of our economic lifeblood working between our two countries." Pompeo said the Department of Homeland Security and the State Department will work together to keep essential industries moving across borders. He said they want to make sure that they keep commerce between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico alive. Responding to questions from DTN, a spokesperson for the State Department on Friday said that each consulate and embassy office worldwide is reviewing its capacity to interview and complete H-2A visa applications. Offices will continue processing H-2A cases as much as possible while trying to ensure social distancing recommended by health authorities. The USDA is conducting a pilot study to see how advanced technologies like remote sensing can improve data collection on crop plantings and on planted acreage. Here's more on that from the USDA's Rod Bain.
A pilot study in Illinois could lead to improvements in how USDA gathers estimates of planted crop acres, especially after the very wet and late start to the 2019 planting and growing season in parts of the country. Linda Young of the National Agricultural Statistics Service at this year's USDA Agricultural Outlook Forum said the study originates from desire to improve statistic gathering using advanced technologies.
Remote sensing and other things to maybe get good estimates sooner, maybe earlier in the growing season, maybe more responsive to these types of events.
Young adds such tech could also complement data collected from producer surveys.
Instead of starting with surveys, let's start with remote sensing, administrative data, weather data, and then assess where we need survey data to correct for the biases that are always present in these other data.
She also says the NASS pilot study in Illinois is scalable and, if successful, could be implemented nationwide. I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
And the EPA's interim registration approval of glyphosate in January now faces its first court challenge, as a number of food safety, farm worker, and environmental groups have asked a federal appeals court to review the decision. The Rural Coalition, Beyond Pesticides, and the Center for Food Safety, among others, filed a petition for review with the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit in San Francisco. Those groups allege that the EPA violated the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act and violated the agency's duties in the Endangered Species Act by not consulting with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service nor the National Marine Fisheries Service before issuing that decision. The EPA finalized the decision on glyphosate, again stating that the herbicide poses no risk to human health and can be used safely with certain drift mitigation requirements. The herbicide's registration review, which started back in 2009, is likely to push on into the year 2021, according to the EPA's website. Next up for you, this week's edition of Tree Tales. Here's K-State forester Bob Atkinson. Bob?
Black walnut is the most commercially valuable tree species in Kansas. It is not uncommon for farmers and ranchers to make thousands of dollars off the sale of black walnut trees, especially in the eastern third of the state. For that reason, it is also a favorite tree to plant. Unfortunately, it is often planted in soils where it cannot thrive. Even though black walnut will grow under a variety of site conditions, it is most productive on well-drained, loamy bottomland soils that do not experience prolonged flooding, such as 3 to 4 days of standing water. Floods that submerge young tree crowns for more than 2 days can kill young walnut trees. Black walnut will grow best in draws and along the base of north and east-facing slopes. Black walnut requires full sunlight and an environment protected from wind and extreme temperature variations. Soils most suitable for black walnut growth are loamy, high in organic matter, and at least 3 feet deep. They should also be well drained with no restrictive layers of coarse sand, heavy clay, gravel, or rocks. Black walnut grows best on soils with a pH of 6.5 to 7.2. Conducting soil tests prior to planting is always a good idea. K-State Research and Extension offices provide soil testing services, and Kansas Forest Service foresters can help landowners interpret the data and consider fertilizing and tree planting options. Soil nutrient requirements for black walnut on an acre basis include 2 to 3.5% organic matter, 0.25 to 0.3% nitrogen, 60 to 80 pounds of phosphate, 3,000 to 4,000 pounds of calcium, and 225 to 270 pounds of potassium. And finally, 375 to 600 pounds of magnesium. Black walnut may be purchased from Kansas Forest Service by calling 785-532-3300 or ordering online at www.kansasforest.org. This is Bob Atkinson with the Kansas Forest Service, encouraging you to make this world a better place by planting trees. You've been listening to another Tree Tale.
Thanks, Bob. And this is Agriculture Today.
When you are in need of timely, reliable, and trusted information, K-State Research and Extension is here. Whether it's organizing people, information, or resources, they have the necessary tools. Community comes first for K-State Research and Extension. For more information and to connect with your county's extension agents, visit www.ksre.k-state.edu.
Welcome back, and thanks for joining us on Agriculture Today. I'm Jeff Wickman. In an effort to minimize the risk of COVID-19, Kansas State University and K-State Research and Extension have implemented several precautions to keep students, faculty, and staff safe. Kansas 4-H program leader and 4-H Youth Development Department head Wade Weber says that 4-H has also taken several steps in line with the university and Extension to protect youth, staff, and volunteers. Wade, just like everything, you are making adjustments with your programming. Give us some background in terms of what your directives are.
We just want to acknowledge that COVID-19 is injecting itself into our own personal, social, and professional lives. And while our campus life as well as our local unit extension office are shifting many of their faculty and staff to work at home and work out different scenarios, it doesn't mean that we're suspending our extension work, but we're thinking differently about how we're going to continue to engage our communities and how we're going to pursue the ideals of our extension mission. And so as we work through this latest challenge, we're purposing to use tools that are available to us in this digital age to encourage engagement with people using distance technology. We're encouraging folks to use tools that are new, but also to engage in some of those tools that we've known for a while but haven't practiced in a while, and so encouraging people to do phone calls, to do letter writing, to connect with 4-H families as well. We think those are some opportunities for us to continue to utilize as we move into this next phase. But I wanted to start by clarifying some of the directives that have been given from Kansas State University and Extension Director Greg Hadley, that all local, regional, state, national, and international K-State research and extension face-to-face events, including 4-H club meetings as well as workshops and shows, anything that's conducted by Extension employees or our Extension volunteers, which includes 4-H volunteers, are to be suspended between March 15th and May 16th. Specifically, they either must be canceled, postponed, or held via Zoom technology. And then secondly, we are strongly encouraged that all local, state, regional, and internal K-State research and extension meetings, this includes boards, task force, volunteer trainings, those types of things as well, that are scheduled between March 15th and May 16th, should be held via Zoom or distant technology whenever available. And if local offices are open, they are to maintain social distancing practices, and the directives have been given that there would be a minimum of 6 feet away from people who are interacting with each other.
Right. The idea here is that we want to keep people engaged, but we want to do it safely, and this is the best way to move forward. And you're actually kind of working off of a couple of different scenarios. You're looking at that May 16th date, knowing that you've got some things that are coming up fairly close to that afterwards, 4-H Discovery Days, 4-H camps. At this point, you want people to just continue to register for those in hopes that they will be able to be held.
Well, that's our desire, is that we would continue engagement with young people through some extraordinary learning opportunities. But we are currently in the midst of planning essentially 2 timetables for the preparation of our summer events. Again, knowing full well that those timetables could change. But currently we are working and planning, and we currently have registration open for Discovery Days. Currently we are talking about registration for camp as well and doing preparations. Over the next couple weeks, our department, in concert with local units, will be putting together the plans for that. We want to continue to affirm that the spirit of 4-H is to encourage and engage young people in learning and provide for them unique learning opportunities, and that's what we're dedicated to provide.
There are a lot of moving pieces, as you point out, and there are also a lot of opportunities still for 4-H youth to continue working on their projects at home.
Absolutely. One of the beauties of 4-H is the opportunity for project-based learning, and the opportunities are still available when it comes to electronic means, the opportunities to pick up a book, to pick up a project guide. So one of the things that we are purposing within Kansas 4-H to provide is the opportunities for resources as well as cross-promoting resources that might come from other land-grant institutions, other educational sites. So I would encourage our constituency across the state of Kansas to be looking at Kansas 4-H's website as well as social media posts for the promotion of those types of activities that young people can do on their own, that families could do on their own, as well as opportunities for unique engagement in a digital learning environment and platform. We're excited to partner with the whole land-grant university system, because this is not something just unique to Kansas, but the beauty of digital technology is we're able to pull resources literally from around the world and to really encourage young people to continue to encourage them to grow, to learn, and look for creative ways as well to encourage connection with their local community. As I was alluding to before, the opportunities to extend generosity, to extend a connection to our community, to encourage members of our community, to affirm those values of connectedness, loyalty, etc. So we want to continue to affirm that side of our humanity, for sure.
And because of the restrictions, if someone has questions for 4-H staff, they can probably find the email on the website. Absolutely.
Our Kansas 4-H website has been updated to explain the directives regarding how our work has changed, as many of us are working remotely now. And the website does articulate how to get a hold of us. Email is our best way to connect. We do have the phones still working and are being forwarded to those who can answer questions as they come up, but just understanding that the timetable for responsiveness to those things will be a little bit delayed, but we continue our efforts to respond to questions as they come in.
And we will continue to do the radio programming, so we'll also have an opportunity to update people at least once a week on what may be going on.
Absolutely. And one of the things I just want to encourage is during this time of challenge in our communities that we look at the spirit of what we're trying to do in extension work. We want to engage our community with trustworthy information backed up by research in order to enhance the quality of life in our community. And secondarily, the spirit of 4-H continues to be true, that we want to affirm to one another and to our community, that as we pursue the day-to-day things of life, that we want to think clearly. We want to express our heart of loyalty to one another. We want to dedicate our hands to service, maybe not being physically in each other's presence, but there's still an opportunity to serve one another. We also, in our pledge, to say we're dedicated to the health of our community by exercising those better living standards. Why? Because we believe it matters to our club, our community, our country, and our world. And so during this time, I want to encourage our volunteers, our professionals, and our 4-H families across the state of Kansas. Here's the time for us to exercise those ideals that we talk about in 4-H and to really think differently, but also think intentionally about how we can continue to affirm one another, encourage learning, and prepare ourselves for what life will be after this storm is past.
That's State 4-H Program Leader and 4-H Youth Development Department Head Wade Weber. Again, for updated information regarding 4-H programming, visit kansas4h.org. And that'll do it for the Monday edition of Agriculture Today. For Eric Atkinson, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.